Tonight, the Gulf War continues.
The ground plan is what scared them all to death.
And look left and right. You see mines everywhere.
The war behind enemy lines.
I looked up and I saw 5 Iraqi guys with their rifles pointed at me. So then I knew I wasn't dead.
The bombs came roaring through that building, picked me up, set me right back down on the floor.
The war between the generals.
So I said, we have not accomplished our mission. I was just damn glad to have the victory in our hands with a minimum loss of casualties.
And the war's ragged end.
That is the aggressor, Saddam Hussein, still in power. That is the President of the United States, no longer in power. I wonder who won.
And now the conclusion of the Gulf War.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by annual financial support from viewers like you. This is Frontline.
For 6 weeks in the winter of 1991, an American-led military machine conducted an air war of unprecedented technological fury against Saddam Hussein. Its target? The centers of military and political life in Baghdad.
The air campaign, which was designed to drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait and win the war without the necessity of ground attack, had not achieved its objective. The Iraqis were very, very badly hurt. It achieved lots of its military objectives. But if you make the assumption that you go to war for a political purpose, which was to change the situation, it had not done that.
In the Saudi Arabian desert, over 500,000 American, British, French, and Arab troops waited for the ground war to begin.
There was a feeling that what they were about to do was something stupendous, something on a vast scale, that it was almost Homeric in its magnitude, and a feeling that it was going to be decisive. That this was the last act, that it had all been building toward this, and that there would be no messy ending, that it would be resolved by force of arms with this one last titanic battle in the desert.
In the final weeks before the ground attack into Kuwait, the Allied commander was haunted by the fear of massive coalition casualties. More than ever, General Norman Schwarzkopf's volcanic temper dominated the headquarters in Riyadh.
Working with Norm Schwarzkopf was sort of like watching a thermometer. The blood would start around the shirt collar, and then it would work its way up to the jawline and then to the ears. And by the time it got to the ears, you ought to watch out.
I would say that working for General Schwarzkopf was a privilege and an honor, but there were many times when if someone had asked me if I would rather have been in that war room or in a dental chair having a root canal without anesthesia, I probably would have chosen the dental chair.
Schwarzkopf was more than a bully. I mean, he was a competent military officer. But for most of the officers that served under him, it was a frightening thing to have this man of such large size and power just exploding all over you. And he did intimidate many of his subordinates, and most of them considered them to be a tyrant and a bully.
I have always regretted the fact that I have a temper. I think it's more the fact that I care so very much about the lives of our troops. When human lives are on the line, you cannot be cavalier. You can't do enough. You cannot do enough. You must do everything you possibly can and leave no stone unturned, and you can never settle for second best or a second-class solution when you're dealing with enterprises of such magnitude that they involve the lives of literally thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
Despite the devastating air campaign, Saddam Hussein still believed he could force a bloody stalemate on the ground, just as he had done in his war against Iran. And he believed that America, still traumatized by Vietnam, had a critical weakness.
Saddam Hussein was counting on Americans' aversion to casualties in support of his strategy, that when the Americans attacked, they would take so many casualties, the American people would rise up and say, this is not worth the effort, and let's see if we can have a negotiated settlement, and he would end up with the fruits of his aggression. That was his strategy.
For 6 months, the Iraqis had prepared for the Allied assault. Their frontline troops surrounded Kuwait behind a barrier of minefields, trenches, and barbed wire. And in reserve, Saddam kept his elite Republican Guard and their Soviet tanks. Despite the bombing, Iraq still had about 400,000 soldiers positioned for battle.
When you're proposing to launch an attack of the magnitude that we were going to launch, with the unknowns out there, you want to do everything you can to level the playing field, to make sure that your forces have every advantage.
But as the ground war grew closer, bitter arguments broke out among Schwarzkopf's commanders about how best to prepare for the land war. The ground commanders wanted to shift the air war to the Iraqi forces in Kuwait. The Air Force wanted to keep targeting Iraqi leadership in Baghdad.
I really believe that General Glosson, Buster Glosson, really believed in his own mind that if he could just have a few more days, hit a few more targets, that there wouldn't be a need for a ground war. Now, hardly anybody else believed that, but I think in Buster's own mind, he believed it.
The Army had one view, and the Air Force, obviously, probably with the Navy, had another view. We believed, and I still do, that the attacking of targets in Baghdad had as much or more to do with the success or failure of that field army than attacking it directly in the overall scheme of what our coalition was trying to accomplish.
They had 41 days of almost uninterrupted bombing. 41 days to bring Saddam to his knees. And someone says to me, or to those ground forces commanders out there, whether they're Army, whether they are coalition forces, or whether they're Marines, that if we didn't have to go out and shape the battlefield and hit those targets that you insisted on us hitting, we could have won this war. I think they're on drugs or something. They must be smoking something.
This air campaign, in its totality, was Norman Schwarzkopf's air campaign. It wasn't Cal Waller's, nor Buster Glosson, nor Chuck Horner's. And the campaign was part of Schwarzkopf's overall war plan. We executed that the way he wanted it executed. If that happened to not be the way Cal Waller thought it should be executed, that's tough.
I distinctly remember telling Buster Glosson one day, Buster, if you divert another flight of aircraft without my approval, I'm going to choke your tongue out. And I think he got the message after that.
Initially, B-52s from the Vietnam era were assigned to attack the Iraqi forces in Kuwait. But most of their bombs fell in an empty desert. An error in the navigation system was corrected, but high winds still blew most of the bombs off course.
We thought that we would destroy tanks somewhere between 20 and 30 a day, and we weren't coming anywhere close. We were down in the area of 6 or 8. And so after about 10 days of that, I knew that we had to do something different.
Glosson decided to send 2 sophisticated F-111 jets on a new mission.
Ready? Now, laser on.
When they reached the Iraqi front lines, the crews saw that even the best camouflage tank showed up as a white rectangle on their heat-detecting cameras. The tanks had grown hot in the daytime sun.
20 seconds.
There's definitely something there.
4-2 is east.
Unlike the B-52s, the F-111s carried laser-guided bombs.
4, 3, 2, 1, impact. Okay, sequence.
I called General Ross and I said, Buster, you wouldn't believe how successful we were tonight. It was really shit hot. We had 7 for 8 direct hits, piece of cake.
The Air Force called it tank plinking. And soon, hundreds of these missions were being flown. Under the constant bombardment, the Iraqi army began to disintegrate. The Allies didn't yet realize it, but some 200,000 soldiers deserted.
It had a devastating effect. Let me give you an example. We paid an inspection visit to one infantry division. There should have been 15,000 soldiers in that division, but we found only 34. There was nobody left. 34 men out of 15,000.
I was wondering why didn't we think about this weeks ago? I was elated because I said, now finally we are providing the ground commanders with something that they sorely need to reduce the number of tanks that they're going to be faced with, or reduce the number of artillery pieces that will be bringing fire upon them as they cross the desert or try to breach those areas. So everyone was happy.
But the bombing of Baghdad also continued. One stealth bomber mission targeted an anonymous intelligence headquarters that was also a prison.
Unlike the way they say in the movies, the way you hear it in the movies, the bombs don't whistle in, they crackle because they're slowing down and crackling through the sound barrier. I heard it crackling through, and it came roaring through that building, and the whole building just literally just shook apart.
Then you hear the second bomb coming in, and by that stage you're fully curled up in a ball, and that's when you hear, and it's deafening as it comes in, and somebody kind of shouted, "Incoming!"
Went right through me, and it picked me up, set me right back down on the floor, and the building literally began to come down around me.
And then the third, and they just got closer and closer, and you just thought, you're just sitting there, waiting.
In Washington, President Bush was growing impatient. Colin Powell and Dick Cheney returned from a final meeting with General Schwarzkopf with the news that the Allied attack could begin in 2 weeks. But Bush was anxious. Moscow's support was weakening, and Gorbachev was suggesting the attack be postponed to allow for negotiations.
So we will just continue down this road. We're the ones that are going to set the time for how this war is, the time for any action that is taken. We are not going to suit somebody else's timetable, whether he lives in Baghdad or any place else. And that's exactly the way it should be.
The president had reason to worry. On Gorbachev's orders, a high-ranking Soviet diplomat traveled to Baghdad. Yevgeny Primakov's mission was to urge Saddam Hussein to accept a face-saving deal.
He came in wearing a long overcoat. It was cold. There was an electric stove on. When we were left alone, I told him, I'm not a military expert, but if a land offensive begins, your troops in Kuwait will be wiped out. You have a great burden of responsibility. Then he said for the first time quite directly, okay, I'm going to withdraw my troops from Kuwait. I just want to be sure that as I retreat, they don't shoot me in the back.
48 hours before the ground attack was due, Iraq's Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz arrived in Moscow. Saddam's admission that he was willing to withdraw had led to some frantic Soviet diplomacy to save their old ally from defeat.
Gorbachev
to me, was making one last attempt to try and have it both ways. He wanted to stay with the United States in the course of this conflict, and yet he also was under, I think, great pressure from various elements of the Soviet bureaucracy to try and preserve this client relationship with the Iraqis and with Saddam Hussein, who, after all, had been a Soviet client for many, many years.
Aziz went straight to the Kremlin. The Soviet president was waiting. Aziz told Gorbachev Saddam wouldn't accept the UN resolutions that called for Iraq to recognize Kuwait's independence and pay it compensation. But he said Iraq would withdraw from Kuwait. Gorbachev thought this was good enough. He called the White House.
I told President Bush, George, you shouldn't just be thinking about how to begin your attack. You should be thinking about how to avoid it. While the generals plan, we should think about how to end the war.
We kept coming back to him and saying, no, you continually are suggesting approaches which do not require an unconditional withdrawal. And we were never, 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 never going to accept a negotiating down from the UN resolutions.
The president summoned his key advisors to discuss the Soviet offer. If Iraq withdrew, it would mean no bloody ground war. But Saddam would walk away unpunished, his war machine undefeated. At dawn, the president called Gorbachev to tell him the deal was unacceptable.
It was a very difficult phone call for the president and a very anguished one for Gorbachev.
I said we shouldn't waste any time. We must still try to find a political way out. He said, I am interested in that. I'm interested in that, understand me. I'm interested in finding a political solution, but nothing happens. Well, I told him, don't lose that will. Don't lose the opportunity. Don't rush things. We're acting together. Let's find a political solution.
The president just said, no, I'm sorry. You know, he's had all the chances. He's had months. He's had from August 2nd. We have given him every opportunity. And we've told him that this aggression would not stand. And now it's too late.
Bush's carefully crafted international coalition was fragmenting. The French president, François Mitterrand, called to demand more time for diplomacy.
We received word that Saddam had blown the oil wells, and I went rushing up to the Oval Office, and Bush used it right then in the telephone call with Mitterrand, sort of, François, we've just received this piece of information that shows that we cannot delay, that Saddam is going to produce a catastrophe in Kuwait. He's already set all the oil wells on fire, and God knows what he may do next. And that pretty well resolved that issue.
As hundreds of oil wells blazed across Kuwait, the president issued a final ultimatum.
The coalition will give Saddam Hussein until noon Saturday to do what he must do. Begin his immediate and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait.
Saddam ignored the warning. To obey, he believed, would have humiliated him in the eyes of the Arab world.
I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf to use all forces available to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait.
More than anything else in those final hours, I was asking myself, what did I forget? What have I missed? What more can I do?